Okay, it's on
Am I
you.
am I shareable?
Well,
I'm
try
sending
it
you the
and
okay, there's the
yeah, there
request.
we go.
So now am I shareable?
Should
Yes.
be.
Yes, you are.
I just thought since we were having a salon, we should
Oh,
look
with
the
their
part.
powdered wigs.
And I said we had to go powder our wigs. And I have a young friend who loves to mess around with AI.
Oh
So
my
I thought you'd
God.
like to see yourselves looking very 17th century.
Oh, that's hilarious.
That is great.
Yes.
We
Wonderful.
should share this, Leslie. This is just amazing.
Well, I
Exactly.
wanted your
We should
permission before I shared it with the whole group. You want
you
me
should
to?
you should send it to
Magazine.
the you should send it to the wider, yeah, the Meredith list and say, this is what you're missing, folks.
I think I will do that. Okay,
Or
I'll do
send it to
that.
Pomona today.
Pomona today, even better.
That would be great.
Inspire our younger comrades
Yes.
to greater heights of continuing education.
Yeah, this could
That,
be you, folks. If you just
This could be you.
if you study enough, you may reach this exalted state.
well, Tony, I think you
Um,
should use it as an advertisement for the salon. That
yeah,
you,
exactly. Well, that's
yeah,
what I'm.
I'll send that out. Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
send it
that's what
out.
I'm suggesting.
yeah.
Now, earlier I cut Laurel. I don't know where we want to start here. I cut Laurel off because I wanted to have what she was saying on the recording. So if you want to continue, Laurel or Barry, if you got, I
Let's
got no
have Laurel
ideas. You
start.
guys take over.
Okay, Laura, why don't you start?
Yeah, I'll just I was not here Tuesday because I was in a 5 day like Quaker conference being Quakery. But so I did watch Alan's talk, which was very interesting. And I wished so much that Dan had been able to be present for your discussion because he had the experience of he and his two brothers grew up in an all black community and went to a segregated all black school um, for their first, I guess, maybe through fifth or sixth grade or something, at which point Kansas City got integrated. And then he and his black comrades, classmates, and friends were transported to an all white school.
It sounds like
But
it went the reverse of integrated.
well, for Dan, of course, they were a little surprised to see these three white kids get off the bus with the black kids. But at any rate, he has talked to me a number of times about the differences that he perceived between the black school, which had good teachers, but the social experience was very different from the white school, which of course had more resources. But also, he said, we were really surprised when we got there. There weren't fights all the time because apparently in the black school, um, there were just a lot of fights. Not people killing each other at that early stage, although later on his neighbors did have some. He lost a number of his neighbors to violence, one way or another. But he said the school experience was very, very different. I don't think he was when he was in the all black school because he was in the neighborhood and he was friends with people, and also he was a kind of big kid, football player type. I don't think he was picked on or bullied any more than just the usual whatever the kids did. But he found the white school very calm, and that was quite a different experience. He said it was just completely different.
In relationship to that, one of the projects that I did at Smiley Middle School, which was a predominantly black middle school, um, we started with the Cyber Cougar Club, and we talked about the digital videos. I mean, the digital stories that we did there. But I quickly became allied with this technology teacher who was white, and she had this dreadful course called um, Microsoft Office. And so the kids had to learn how to use Microsoft Word, how to use Excel, and so on, and with no particular project or purpose involved except This is how you do it. And the kids were clearly bored and it wasn't going well for her. And I said, so I have this idea. I want to bring in some people from the technology department of the university who are Black. And let's try to do some more advanced stuff like create websites and forget about Microsoft Office. And I want to put them in groups. The initial conversation will be, what would you like to make websites about? So we have this conversation in class, and overwhelmingly, they wanted to make websites about fashion, music, and sports. And I was thinking to myself, I'm not interested in any of these topics, maybe music, but I'm not interested in fashion or sports. But the kids overwhelmingly thought that as long as they could pursue those topics, they would be interested in getting into the technology. Well, so, I was learning so much about their attitude toward fashion, because when I looked at them, I didn't see any fashion. But when they looked at each other, they were hyper aware of what shoes they were wearing and what hoodies or sweatshirts that they were wearing. And, that they were crazy about certain brands like South South Pole, FUBU. FUBU stood for us, by us. These were Black clothes made by companies run by Black people. And so they knew when you were wearing a FUBU sweatshirt, and that had status. And, kids were revealing that they had spent, $80 for a pair of shoes. And this is back when $80 in today's money would be $200. And I'm thinking, you guys don't have any money. Why in the hell would you spend that kind of money on a pair of shoes? And they said, well, it's precisely because we don't have any money that these things matter so much. I mean, we're displaying pride and identity in what we wear. And, I thought white people are totally oblivious to this. We had no clue that this sweatshirt was prestigious or these shoes were important to these kids. And so I was working with a music group and they were having really interesting conversations among themselves. Like, for example, they would say, well, we have to like rap. I mean, because that's our music. But wouldn't it be better if we like jazz? I mean, when you think back, jazz was kind of invented by Black people, but we don't listen to it anymore. And, I think that these gangs, when they're going to go out and do a shoot by or a fight or something, they get all hyped up on rap. And so maybe it's not so good for us with that should be the only kind of music that we all agree is the best and our music. And so, I mean, there's this whole social uh, world in a predominantly Black school that I don't think white people are even vaguely aware of if they haven't spent time in a school like that.
Yeah.
That brings up, go ahead, Leslie. Go
Oh,
ahead.
well, two things. I was going to say when I was first teaching at Belmont High, which was a very multiracial school, I think we had 90 different ethnic groups that they'd counted. And I had this girl who, for the first time in a long time, was really paying attention to me in class. And I thought, oh, great, a breakthrough. So after class, she comes up to me and she said, Miss Taylor, where'd you get your shoes? And I realized the whole time I thought, oh, I'm going to have to pay attention to what I'm wearing because I was oblivious to what I was wearing. But the other thing that I think is so cool is that you were open to learning from the students, even though you thought you weren't interested in fashion or their music or whatever, because I've really been thinking, like when I went to ask this young friend to help me do the AI to put wigs on everybody, I thought it used to be that kids were supposed to be taught by their teachers because adults knew more. Adults had more experience. And that has sort of shifted now. The adults might know a lot about some things, but there's so much that kids know that we don't know. And I discovered early on, I could either be really snobby about my grandkids playing games all the time, or Dungeons and Dragons, or I could ask them to explain it all to me. And that was the difference, is when I asked them that I was the ignorant one, could they please teach me about it?
Yeah, this whole question about clothing brings up this question about to what extent should we encourage or discourage kids from bringing their street culture or their out of school culture into the classroom? Because while it's very positive, as Alan said, to sort of affirm some of this, and what you're saying, Leslie, it's sort of, let's, make it feel like the school welcomes this. On the other hand, a number of schools found it very disadvantageous in terms of what they were trying to do to have kids wearing insignias or clothing that expressed political or cultural views and move toward uniforms because
Yeah.
it took that out of the equation. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about that, Alan, or anybody else, because I think it can cut both ways. I've kind of followed education since I retired from teaching, and I've noticed that in the charter schools, some of them intentionally exclude, personal clothing choices by the kids because they find it distracting from what they're trying to accomplish.
So I'm interested, Barry, in the comment on the uniforms. And my daughter went after a year or two in the, I guess after a year in the Texas school, which told me that if I waited long enough, eventually in a few years, she would learn something. And that they thought that was fine. But she went to an Episcopalian school. That was the Catholics, the Baptists, the military academy, or the Episcopalian school. And I figured that was the only one she wouldn't be kicked out of it in the first week. Anyway, they had a uniform requirement, and every year the kids would get annoyed about some feature of the uniform, that the girls couldn't wear shorts in the summer, or that they had certain requirements on socks or something. And the kids would be very annoyed about this, and they would organize and have a petition to change this. And they would really organize and have get all upset about this, and eventually, after a lot of negotiation, they could get the change. The headmaster told me sometime along after several years that they actually thought this was a very helpful process, and that part of the reason they had fairly strict uniform things and allowed this negotiation was that the kids were very much empowered, and they learned a lot about organizing and politics. And so it was apparently quite strategic to give the kids openings for organizing, but they had to had to be organic and come from within them, and they had to get all the grades together and work together on it to get a change in policy. It wouldn't work if just a few kids asked. They had to, and that wasn't exactly a stated rule. The kids had kind of figured that out. So I thought it was fascinating that the administration was a little social manipulation there to allow this as part of the process.
I went to a really small um, boys' school, and we didn't have uniforms. After seventh grade, we had to wear a coat and tie,
Wow.
and you were had a lot of freedom of what you wanted to wear with a coat and tie, but but it had to be coat and tie, and it was very. I mean, there were 200. The entire student body from first grade to 12th, the most they ever had when I was there was about 205 kids, and my graduating class had 25 kids.
So, Doug,
Yeah,
did you wear outlandish ties?
of course, of
I
course.
have a question about um, how teachers dress, whether they try to dress more formally to set a tone for the class and to sort of separate themselves. I noticed in the autobiography you sent Alan that the young girl liked the white teacher who had dreads and she felt comfortable with him. I had this discussion recently with somebody that John went to medical school with who had written an article for, I think it was maybe the New York Times, about he refused to wear a white coat. He always dressed in casual, almost track clothes and stuff like that, and had a big beard and all this stuff because he felt it was important to be on the same level as his patients, not to be coming in as a separate class of person wearing a white coat.
So the
And I
tie
was,
thing is interesting.
yeah, I
Tie,
was,
oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, but I was thinking about that. Is that true? And I was thinking, okay, so when I take people to the ER who are older, and the nurses come in and they're covered with tattoos and have rings in their noses and stuff like that, they aren't comfortable with that. They would rather have somebody come in looking a little bit like um, they are educated and separate. You know what I
A
mean?
doctor.
Yeah, or even a doctor, or yeah. So I was sort of curious to know among you all, what was your impression of teachers who just wanted to be buddies and showed that
I
maybe in their clothes, and teachers who wanted to be setting a example as being a level to aspire to?
I thought about this a lot, and there's no answer to it. Some students want to be your friend, and some students want to respect you. I always wore a sport coat in class after having considered this forever, and it was there was a subtle indication that I'm not you. I'm the teacher, and I am in authority, and I will flunk you. I mean, none of that was said out loud, and none of it was because my demeanor was always very friendly. But uh, I don't have a right answer to that, but I certainly thought about it. That I don't want to be thought of as your pal because uh, my position is I have to judge your performance.
That turned out to be, I think, really important for me. The year following Pomona, when I taught in San Luis, Colorado, in a entirely Hispanic community, and I wore a white shirt and a tie and a sports jacket to class every day. And the reason that I did that in my own mind was that I wasn't very much older than these kids. I mean, I was 21 and they were 14. I was 7 years older than they were. And I wanted to make it clear that I was an adult and they were not. And so that's why I dressed like that. But in their minds, they were aware that there were four other Anglo teachers in the town, mostly teaching at the high school, and who dressed informally. Um, and they called them the hippie teachers. And they were always, questioning me, like, Mr. Davis, we saw you with the hippie teachers in the bar last Saturday, but you're not a hippie teacher. You wear a tie, you don't look like them at all. And they had a certain amount of contempt for the so-called hippie teachers that I think my friends, I was close friends with all of them, they were not aware that the students sort of found that insulting. And so, it's complex, but I do think that a teacher is better off doing what Tony is suggesting and saying, I am an adult authority figure here. I'm not your buddy.
You know, and also a completely parallel thing, Alan. I worked for the welfare department in Richmond, California for 2 years, and my clients were almost all black. And I started out just dressing like in jeans and a t-shirt, real cash, and my supervisor, who was black, called me into her office one day and said, "Look, you can't be doing this. You're showing no respect for your clients. They think you're dressing down because you don't respect them. So why don't you show up with a little more, a little more class?" I had no idea that that's how I was perceived by them because I thought I was being like a bro, you know. But no, that wasn't the right image.
When I was in school, I was at this small private boys' school. We were all children of privilege, and by the time I graduated, I swore I would never, if I was a teacher, I would never teach at a school like that because we were such shits. It was really, they would treat professors, the teachers, poorly. The ones that had the most sort of buddy type relationships were the ones who were also coaches, like the soccer coach, because I played soccer. Um, the we also, except for the head coach, he didn't teach any other classes, but the other coaches were all had other classes that they taught. But basically, they really were not very nice people. The students, probably myself also.
Yeah, so I taught mostly in graduate schools and medical schools and some undergraduate, and I actually had an easier time figuring out what to do with students, even though I was younger than quite a few of my students when I first started teaching in at least in graduate school. And I did dress more formally, but it was trickier in medical schools, especially early on when I was the only woman in some departments and trying to figure out because the doctors are very hierarchical. They call each other Dr. X, and they call the staff by first names, of course, all women, and or even some of the men there. And the hierarchy nearly drove me crazy because I am a Californian. I'm not going to call my colleagues doctor this and then feel like I'm not going to respect them. And they don't treat all the but when I was at Harvard, I actually got a tie and started wearing a suit and tie because I wanted to blend in with the all male department just a little bit. I still wore sort of short skirts, um, but the thing I'm still kind of struggling with this. One of my colleagues that I work with um, has all of her trainees, postdocs even call everybody doctor, and they're all calling me Dr. Beckett, and I'm doing research with it. And I just feel like at some point the hierarchy is is a little crazy making. My parents were interesting because less like your older people, they were a little dubious about. My dad was great with women doctors. He actually was more respectful, I think, with them or more listened to them better. He thought they probably had to have been smarter. But when they moved here, they lost their wonderful woman doctor, and I asked around and got this doctor for them, who was said to be, and he was wonderful, but he had a ponytail. And my mother was like, "He has a ponytail." I said, "Mom, just be patient and see how it works out." And after a while, she decided he was terrific and really loved him. But there was this initial like, is he a serious person? If he actually is, I mean, he wore the white coat and everything. The ties are interesting because now, at least if you're doing clinical practice, there's a little tendency to either keep your coat buttoned or not wear a tie because they're germ magnets. And so the tie thing, apparently is actually not best clinical practice. You know, you're dragging something around, it gets coffee, people cough on it and spit on it, and then it brushes against things. So people are not supposed to wear clothing that could be um, unsafe clinic or could be icky clinically. And of course, they don't get thrown in the laundry the way the white coats do. That the big advantage of the white coat is that if somebody, you know, barfs on it or coughs on it or whatever, it's going to go in the laundry, and your suit, your sport coat does not get cleaned the way a white coat does.
Well, I will say that my experience teaching sixth grade in Ukiah, California in the 70s, in the early 70s, I was definitely on the more be their pal rather than be the authority figure side of the spectrum. First of all, because I just looked different from all the other teachers. My hair was longer. I was clearly a member of the counterculture visibly. And my teaching philosophy was completely anti-traditional. So I was coming there to intentionally to depart from the traditional structure. And in fact, it occurred to me that one of the rubrics that I took away from my teaching education at San Francisco State was to depart from the idea that the children, the students, were empty vessels that we were supposed to fill up with knowledge, and transform it to the fact that the students were people with agency and intelligence and cultural background and interests that needed to be incorporated into the educational process rather than distanced from it. And so I was on the completely different. And plus, I ran track with my students during recess and after school, so I needed to be dressed appropriately. So I was always wearing tennis shoes and jeans and informally. And to some extent, it was worked against me because there were times when I wanted to assert a level of authority, but it was too late because I'd already let the genie out of the bottle, and it was really hard to put it back in, and I had to just kind of go with it. But it was definitely, and I think this changes as you move up the scale into high school, junior high school, and college. I think in high school it's much more probably appropriate to present a more you know, adult or I am the purveyor of knowledge. I run the classroom. I was intentionally trying not to do that. So
You know, you guys, what you've said has reminded me that for teachers and maybe for medical people too, you're not just dressing for your relationship with the students, but you're dressing for the relationship with the other teachers and the administrators. And like when I was a new teacher at Belmont, I was 4 years older than my students, than my seniors. And when I first showed up at school, I got told by another teacher to get out of the teacher's parking lot. Um, and and I looked really young, and I wasn't a hippie, but I was wearing, I guess, my mother-in-law thought I was. So, I it's hard to say. And John, as a doctor, always wore a sport coat if it wasn't too hot and ties, but they were Jerry Garcia ties. And he was famous for his ties. And he wore purple, orange, red, whatever t-shirts under his 100% cotton shirts that I had to iron. And he always had his swimming trunks on in case a body of water should present itself. And he had his bike in the back of the truck. So, I mean, but you remember some J.D. Salinger short story had the guy who was doing the radio program with the quiz kids,
yeah,
and he talked about how they, even though nobody was going to see them, they should dress up out of respect for their audience, even though the audience couldn't see them. And I think some of you people have mentioned that it's not only for maintaining your position, but also for the other teachers and the administrators to take you seriously. Otherwise, especially if you're a young woman, you're toast.
Oh, think that this on the subject of how you appear to the other teachers and your relationship with them. I would just comment on the teachers' lounge and the phenomenon of the teachers' lounge. The first time when I first started teaching in Ukiah and I walked into the teachers' lounge, I was appalled by the fact that they were all smoking cigarettes, first of all. And secondly, that they never talked about the students or anything about the education. They didn't want to talk about that at all. They looked at the teachers' lounge as a respite from all of that. And so I quickly decided I would never set foot in the teachers' lounge again. And I never did. And I and I would always stay in my classroom during recesses and let the kids who wanted to stay. But the teachers' lounge was definitely a cultural marker of my differentiation of my approach to teaching to what they were doing.
Another aspect of this that's peculiar to us as a generation is that the war in Vietnam shaped us to not want to be identified with the political establishment. We were protesting, we were pushing back. And, I kind of keep learning about myself in respect to this all my life that, the idea don't trust anyone over 30 and, you know, don't be part of the establishment that is oppressing people and getting us into wars and sending poor kids over to die, that I really didn't want to be an authority figure. I didn't want to be part of the establishment. And as a teacher, I was always aware of this conflict that I wasn't going to be able to control this class and actually facilitate these kids learning if I didn't take on an identity of authority. I'm in control here. We're going to be doing what I say we're going to be doing, and I'm going to get input from you. But ultimately, I have to run this class. I have to organize it. And, more recently, um, I've been on this leadership development team at my church, which is helping recruit people to serve on the board of trustees and other committees of the church. I mean, Unitarian Universalists are very democratic and governed by committees and voting on things all the time. And um, I realized that this whole idea of leadership um, has been something that I've had to wrestle with. I mean, even on the faculty at the university, I there was a period of time that when some colleague became an assistant dean and then went into administration, became a dean, I felt like they'd copped out, like they'd gone over to the bad side. Um, that you shouldn't be part of the administrative machinery because those people just they don't actually do things, they just have meetings. And, I think I'm still really coming to appreciate how really important good leadership is and having good meetings and following agendas and making wise decisions and that you know life is not a Dilbert cartoon actually. It's not just the worker bees that actually accomplish everything. Um, but I did. I don't know what other people feel about that, but I feel like I was really shaped by being in the class of 68 or the graduating class of 69 or 7. I mean, that there was a real desire not to be part of an authority structure.
Yeah, no,
In
definitely.
the music business, I'm just relating this to the music business. When I grew up if your band didn't have uniforms, you really weren't a band yet. You know, you were just some kind of garage guys that got together. The real bands had uniforms. The Beatles never played a show without wearing uniforms. And then the Stones came along, and the Byrds were the first American band that didn't wear uniforms. Everybody did it until then. And the thing was that if you wore a uniform now, after the 68, just what you're talking about, Alan, you were identified with the man. You know, the only people who wore uniforms were lounge acts, or you know, and the funny thing is, I think maybe sociologically kind of interesting. That didn't happen in the black community. To this day, the Temptations would never go out just wearing street clothes. That's not going to happen. You had to look sharp, and the band had to look sharp, and that
Yeah.
continues to this day. Because I suppose I don't know. You tell me why that is, but I was kind of disappointed when uniforms went out of style because I thought it was kind of cool to, you know, it was like I always associated with Jerry Rice, who gets, you know, perfectly uh, clean and sharp before he goes on the field. It gets muddy, you know, because he's preparing himself to be perfect. And I always liked that ritual in being in a band, but it's not continued with the white groups to this day. Nobody's ever gone back to that.
That would that would be a really good shtick, you know, if a group did now. I wonder how that would play.
It would be, yeah, just be wrong. You know,
I don't
it'd be
know.
like a joke or like campy or something if you did it.
Maybe.
Well,
I think there's
I opened this can of worms by bringing up the topic, but I just wanted to say when I was reading Neil's comments and the autobiography that Alan included, I have about 14 other topics that I
Go,
would like to discuss here.
let's go.
And one of them would be how you get the kids who are coming sort of from the edges and not comfortable at school to find the thing at school that's going to lure them in and make them willing to also learn some of the other stuff. For example, there's an argument among the coaches, particularly, that you have to have these really developed sports programs because some kids wouldn't come to school if they weren't into sports. But I, we had a situation at the high school that I used to teach at, which all of this happened after I left, where the vocational training was revolutionized by one woman who knew how to write grants. You know, in the olden days, guys could take for vocational training, they could take shop, and females took home ec, right? That was it. She came in as a home ec teacher and she wrote this grant and changed home ec into culinary training. And as many guys were taking it as girls, um, they were wearing the official meat cleaving protective gloves. They were entering contests, women and men, or boys and girls, cake decorating. They were entering contests in other states, etc. And then more recently, but I think she is also the one who wrote these grants. They transformed vocational training at that school by getting grants in four areas that kids could go immediately from high school into a paying job. And I don't know how many millions of dollars they got to do this. The culinary school ended up with two huge professional kitchens with closed caption TV so you could see what was going on, with a pizza oven, with a barista school, okay, and a restaurant that
Ah,
they give demonstrations you can come into. That was the first one. There were four programs. The next one was teachers of an elementary school across the street. They made a classroom with one way glass, so for observation of the kids. They had desks that the chairs were on springs. So the hyperactive kids could be doing this the whole time without getting out of their seats, and all these other very innovative things. The third thing was a total um, sound and video and all that technical stuff. Studio, they put on radio shows, they put on TV shows, they did work for people in the community doing videos, advertising, all of that stuff. And the fourth one was a whole, like an ER room for kids to learn medical assistantship, including x-ray machines and all this stuff, reading x-rays, sports medicine, all this stuff. So I sort of went, and meanwhile, the English department still had the same crappy old textbooks we always had. Nobody wrote a grant. But I'm just saying, I was thinking, it doesn't just have to be sports. I think it was Neil. You talked about the heuristic of, what you're familiar with, which was one of the things mentioned among the heuristics that people have to work against when they want to be wise seniors. Um, if kids don't know what they want to be when they grow up because they've only been exposed to being a professional athlete. But it's the job of the education to give them a peek into some of the possibilities. Not that they have to go into those four areas, but they can sort of say, oh, these are possibilities. These are things that I could do. And the most influential thing I've seen is the AAUW, the Association of American University Women, has a thing called Tech Trek. That's their whole purpose in Chico, is to raise money for Tech Trek, which sends junior high school girls to Davis and Santa Cruz during the summer, where they have all these amazing scientific women come in and mentor them in different little sub camps where they learn all this stuff, how you can be a scientist and it's okay. You're not just a weird kid. So I'll shut up about that. But I was thinking, for me, that's one of the most promising things because all the kids are involved in these programs and it seems to cross all the barriers about what your home sociological culture is. It's really a great equalizer.
Seems to me the biggest thing that high school can teach is that a student can find a place where they can excel. I don't think it doesn't matter what the subject matter is if they can. That's why these ideas that they should quit music and art and all these other classes is so stupid because not everybody's going to be an English scholar. They're just
Yeah.
not, and so you should have as wide a variety. I'm just agreeing with you completely, Leslie, that you should have as wide a variety of options available, if nothing else, just to teach them that they can do something and excel at it.
Yeah, this brings up to me Howard Gardner's work on multiple intelligences. And I'm sure you're
Yeah.
familiar with it, Alan, some others maybe too. But Howard
Mhm.
Gardner took a look at the broad range of intelligence, and he concluded that traditional academic education in our schools deals with only a small part of that large range of intelligences. And so you have this situation where you're rewarding people for language skills or formal math skills, but you're not dealing with aesthetics, musical skills, artistic skills, topographical skills, all kinds of
Social
other
skills.
ways that the brain actually exhibits intelligence. So you're really narrowing the focus. So I totally agree with everything Leslie's saying, and I'd love to hear from Neil on this too, because I know you wrote about this and we're posting.
I I always one of the advices I gave to my kids and other kids, I've actually written a book about this whole thing, is try new things because I know with my kids, and I don't know about your kids, I wanted them to try a whole bunch of things, not because I thought they're going to be any good at it, but it's kind of like a virus, they go to preschool and they come back with all kinds of stuff, and you don't know what's going to get you. You don't know when your kids go out into the world what they're going to do, but unless you show it, give them the possibility, they don't, they have no, it goes back to what Tony and other buddies say. If you don't show them art, if you don't show them music, they don't know about that. There's this great vignette. There's a woman who she is an African American. She's a pilot for United Airlines, and she's almost ready to retire. And she says, "I never saw anybody like me as a pilot. I just always wanted to be a pilot." So she says, "I make a point of always standing outside the cockpit and saying hello to everybody who walks in and off that plane so that I can tell other people that this is, you know, may never thought you're going to be a pilot, but who knows?" Um, but I definitely agree with it. If you have to expose it's that whole sense of what do you that the heuristic about it, what's available. If I only think I can do that, then I don't know that I could do something else.
And I think that this idea of intelligence has been formalized into the idea of an IQ and an IQ test. And this has done so much damage because the kinds of things that an IQ test measures focus so much on pattern recognition, whether they're geometric patterns or sequences of words and so on. And the kinds of uh, things like jazz music, for example, which is clearly an intelligence that many people don't have, but it's every bit an intelligence as solving certain kinds of math problems. And, uh, I just feel that visual arts, um, there's so many different kinds of mental activity that should be recognized as important, valuable. I mean, we do recognize them every time we, go to a movie or something, that we see the people who created that sort of thing have important mental abilities that can be developed, um, that we really need to break away from the math and reading as being what school should mainly be about.
Yeah. I think this goes back to something we were talking about in your last presentation, Alan, which is that to some extent, when you accept that narrow model, the school becomes an instrument for socialization more than it does for mental development. So it's sort of like you're learning how to do school and school behavior, which means sitting at your desk and doing work and taking pap quizzes and so on. It does not accept the idea that moving around in the classroom should be a valid thing, or conversing with your fellow students during the learning process. So we end up with a very narrow spectrum of what we accept. And again, a lot of these kids who come from minority backgrounds, or in my case, teaching from the Indian cultures, we're getting the things that were rewarded and respected in their culture weren't acknowledged in the classroom at all. So they were stranger in a strange land when they came into this classroom. And I really believed at that time, and I still believe that you can't deny those things as valid and expect people to engage with what you're trying to communicate.
But those things may be valid, but how far are they going to take a kid after he gets out of school? How far are they going to take him through life? It's true.
Yeah,
It just
yeah,
seems to me indisputable that you have to know how to read and write
yeah.
and compute.
Yeah, to be fair, there really are some basic skills that are going to benefit you no matter what you do. I mean, I had a landscaper a long time ago that wrote up a proposal. It was perfectly written. There were no grammatical or spelling mistakes in it. That was important. And he's a landscaper, you know, he's not a rocket scientist. But the fact that he could write was impressive. And I think that's, you know, it's not to be dismissed lightly, learning how to read and write and do math.
When I was in school, in high school, I wasn't really great at math. Didn't have really good math teachers. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to be a geologist. I wanted to specializing in mineralogy because I'd been collecting minerals since I was 12. You know, and going to quarries and puttering around and finding cool stuff. And I wanted to keep doing that. I wanted to go to Colorado School of Mines, and but I was useless in higher math. And in those days, a calculator was the size of a large desktop dictionary. They were huge and expensive, and I so that was like I thought, oh well, and went on to be a creative writing team student in in one of Dick Barnes' classes. So but if I'd had a skill in math, who knows, would have been different.
Yeah,
Well,
you'd never been able to, sweep chimneys.
You
Um,
need math, and
yeah,
I
yeah.
used to have to use calculating programs to calculate the volumes of chimney flues where I was going to put a liner in. So need math everywhere.
Yeah.
I think what
Neil, oh,
I'm
sorry.
sorry. I was thinking what I was talking about before when I was mentioning the different vocational tracks was and sports is if you can find a way to get kids interested in being there at school and there's something they can do they excel at, then sometimes you can explain to them how being able to communicate well with English is going to be to their advantage with what they're interested in. And then you can talk about deeper levels of not just here's your vocabulary list, learn it, but how do you use prefixes, roots, and suffixes to unlock the meanings of all these different words you might encounter when you're doing this or when you're doing that or when you're doing this and how using language and the organization of the grammar of your language is how you actually think, how you write something, you discover that your premise was wrong because you follow the logic of it. So I think um, that the math and the English, if you can lure the kids that don't see why they should be learning that crap in, you sort of set you throw your cast your line out there with some good bait and then you reel them in.
I suspect that everybody here under our powdered wigs um, loved learning, and I loved being in school most of the time,
Mm-hmm.
and I love to learn stuff, so that was really a plus, and it carried me well past the time I had learned how to study stuff that the school wanted me to study.
It's an
Because I was
interesting psychological thing, isn't it? You probably know people, I certainly do, that just hated school from the get go. Ah, they're just trying to jam this stuff down my throat, you know? I mean, I don't, I, that baffled me. I found just about everything interesting. And they had some kind of, it was an authority thing or something that they thought they were being manipulated, uh, not to their advantage or something. I don't know how you overcome that.
when I was at Pomona. I mean, it took me until my theoretically senior year to figure out how to do what I wanted to do and have it also satisfy what the school wanted me to do, and which is one of the reasons I didn't finish. But it was still, that was a hard thing to learn because I just wanted to learn what I wanted to learn,
But
and I
that's an
was in a
education in itself, how to manipulate the environment to
yeah.
benefit you.
I wish I'd learned a little sooner though.
So I had a different sort of experience. I talked a little bit before about my elementary school through eighth grade. But one of the things was everyone was expected to try things, including stuff that you weren't good at. And there were people who were really good. We had Mac, and there were people who already were sewing their own clothes. And I'd never done any of that, but um, part of it was doing it with people who would help you and could say, that. And I told you about my experience getting to play basketball because some very nice kid encouraged me to learn how to shoot free throws. And the thing that was really nice about this was that everybody, it was acknowledged that there would be things you weren't good at and things you were, but that you were sort of expected to have some breadth of trying things. And that the people who were good at it, the idea was if you were really good at something, the rest of your life, you were probably going to be asked to help people at it. If you were the one who first to learn something, you might as well get good at helping people too. And it was rewarded, that the helping part was rewarded. So it wasn't just teachers. And you felt part of a learning community. And there was a sort of excitement that went with that. And they weren't really trying to turn us all into identical widgets. There was
Right.
a for people being individuals who came with skills. Like one kid could, if you put him in charge of things, everything got done. And he was just good at managing. And
One thing I would add to that, that I think it just supports what Neil and Leslie were saying too, is, bringing people into the classroom who are not teachers, but who do other jobs and do have other skills. And I did that a lot. I had a lot of freedom as a Title VII teacher where I could bring resource people in, people who were part of the Indian community or people who worked in different nonprofits or whatever. And just that exposure, the representation, the point you were making, Neil, about just being aware that there are people who can do these things and can make a living doing them. And a lot of them were skills that they got outside of schools. Because again, schools were really focusing on a very narrow spectrum of those skills. So I think that's important. The other thing I want to say is one thing I learned working at Disney Imagineering for 27 years was that there are visual thinkers and there are verbal thinkers, and their brains operate very differently. And one thing, if you're in a meeting, well, I'm a verbal thinker, so I'm in meetings and we're talking about stuff, and this is how the ideas are developed. And there were people in those meetings who were visual thinkers who had nothing to say in the meetings at all and couldn't wait to leave the meeting and go back to their office and start sketching. And that's where all their ideas would come to fruition. And I had to learn to respect that. And one thing I learned in doing that is that verbal thinkers attach a great deal of value to visual thinkers and vice versa. So, like if you're a writer, you tend to revere any artist who does a drawing that you can't ask them to change anything because it's such a magical thing that they do. And that if you're an artist and you're reading a treatment by a writer, you don't feel like you can ask them to change anything because you can't do that, and you get put it on a high pedestal. And it's interesting how the work we did involved both verbal thinkers and visual thinkers, so we had to learn how to cross that membrane and communicate. But it took some learning, and I think again, I don't think that the traditional educational structure, at least in elementary schools when I was there, really valued the visual side of thinking as much as it did the verbal side.
well, then is teaching, teaching concepts. Like I teach regression models and whatnot in different classes. And there are people who learn from the pictures. There are people who learn from the verbal expression. There are people who see it in the equations right away. And there are people who have to have something kinesthetic. And explaining dichotomous variables. I mean, I literally would go step up, step down, and I would actually physically have do this and have kids either do it or imagine doing it to explain variables that had different levels and that mattered. And that stuck with people. But you have to try to see because there are going to be a few of each kind in every class, and they're
Yeah.
going to do everything differently. And sometimes one of the kids can explain it better than I can because they may have better words or a better picture. So try to say kids, this is more for graduate students, but even I've done some guest teaching in junior highs, and you try every little approach and get the kids to say, does that make sense?
That
Because
really
they're
comes into play in elementary school mathematics teaching because a lot of the traditional teaching is in the abstraction of numbers and equations, but there are physical tools that can allow you to teach math concepts much more effectively. I remember I used to do this rubber band math geometry things with a matrix of nails and a board and rubber bands, and it was a great tool for teaching geometric concepts of area and perimeter and so on. And I also remember using Cuisenaire rods, which were another great tool for a tactile tool for teaching fractions and other things. So, these are. It's not that we're abandoning math and English. It's that we're being diversified in how we think about imparting these concepts to people.
I
You know,
think,
I think we're talking about two concepts that are really important that we need to bring together. One of them is this idea that people think and learn differently. They have different uh, intelligences, they have different ways of using their minds that help them to grasp and succeed in school related kinds of activities. And the other thing is this idea that we bring an identity to the class. We bring a sense of who am I? Can people like me become this thing? Can people like me be good at this subject? Can I, if I'm a woman, can I aspire to be an airline pilot? I mean, those kinds of questions. And I'm just reminded that the most extreme example of this that I encountered was when I did a sabbatical in Barcelona with the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And they had projects like mine working with gypsy kids. And they ran their after school project at the Gitano um, Cultural Center. And the head of the Gitano community was a big promoter of the university after school project. So I was hanging out there and came to realize that the, and I use the word gypsy. I know we're supposed to call them Roma to be politically correct, but in Barcelona, they called themselves gypsies. They called themselves Gitano. And so the question was, what kind of work can gypsies do? And so we're having this conversation with these teenage kids, and they're saying, well, we were musicians and we're dancers, um, and we sell clothing on the streets and we make jewelry, um, and that's about it. And so I raised the question, could a gypsy be a teacher? And there was a lot of silence. And then kids started to argue, well, none of us have ever met or seen a gypsy who was a teacher. We've never had a teacher who was a gypsy. I would say that a gypsy wouldn't want to become a teacher because they would be really distancing themselves from the community. But I worry that if one of us did become a gypsy, a teacher, we would no longer be a gypsy. In other words, they wouldn't allow us to live here and and be part of the community because we would be so different, so estranged. And I knew that the people at the university were cultivating the daughter of the head of the gypsy community, trying to suggest that she should become a student at the university and that they would help her succeed at the university. And she was really tempted and interested in doing that and getting, but afraid, really afraid to talk about it within the community for fear that they would ostracize her, that basically they would say, you cannot do that. No one has ever done that. We don't know anyone who would go to the university and get a degree. I mean, you'd be learning all these things that are completely foreign and antagonistic to who we are. And, you know, to some, and they had this word payo, which meant non-gypsy. And they divided the world into Gitano and Payo. And you say, well, what about this black person? Payo. What about this Chinese person? Payo. What, you know, and what about this Spanish speaking person who's not a gypsy? Payo. That they basically had one word that included everybody who was not a gypsy. And you did not want to be one of those people, let alone marry one or something like that. It was extremely closed community, and they always had this idea that the authorities were going to come down on them, put them in concentration camps or something like Hitler had done. And so they had relatives in France and other countries that they communicated with so that if the police were coming down on them in Barcelona, that they could all escape to France and join the gypsy community there. And you know, it's just it had to lesser versions. I feel like Native American kids that I've worked with, and to a lesser extent, Black kids that I've worked with, had issues of identity that were somewhat parallel to this. Like, well, if I'm going to be true to being a Native American, I cannot be good at math. There's a contradiction there. I should not, I will not do that stuff. I don't know, Barry, is that in keeping with any of your experience?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Like the
definitely.
being white, that if you're black, you can't get educated in a certain area or do something because of being white. But then you have the woman who's the airline pilot. So
Yeah.
if somebody crosses that line, there has to be a first person who says, but I am still a gypsy, but I went to college.
I mean, to
Yeah.
some extent, this is true of all in groups and out groups, isn't it? That they
Yeah.
define themselves, they define their group by who they're not. I mean, growing up Jewish, there was the Jews and there was the Goyim, the non-Jews. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not uncommon.
Yeah.
The
Tribalism
Navajo,
is all about the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Navajo
We
kids use this
we
phrase.
are about. I'm sorry,
Uh, Navajo
Alan.
kids use this case biligana bisana, which
Yeah.
means the white man's apple, red on the outside, white on the inside.
Uh,
We're at an hour and 15 now, and we haven't even gotten to Neil's letter. Neil sent out a letter, and I'm sure we'd like to address that. And then next up, if I'm not mistaken, is Otis. So, what do you suggest we do? Neil, do you want to, shall we continue this next time with starting with your issues?
you can or not, because actually, after I made it out of the other session, a lot of what we're talking about now is kind of what I was getting at is that you have that other, I have to take my identity off to be able to be white, right? White being school is white. I'm not white, so I'm not in school, that kind of thing. Um, but it's up to you guys. I'm happy to. I wanted to provoke people to kind of just think about all this stuff because it's not as easy as even Alan's research has shown. None of this is easy.
Maybe we
Yeah.
should ask Otis how much he would mind putting his session off for another.
Oh, we've already
I
done that
wouldn't.
once. He's
Am I on mute or not? Because I'm on a phone. I can't tell.
No,
no,
we can hear
we
you.
can hear you.
Okay, I am fine waiting for another session. No problem.
Well, why? Because I have some things we still didn't even get to that I wanted to talk about, which
Right.
is the role of technology in all this. So can
Yeah.
we continue this conversation one more time and then?
Yeah, let's do
Okay.
that then. That I think that's the group consensus. So we'll start. Maybe Neil, you can start out for Barry if you have ideas next time, and then
He has
Otis
more stuff
keeps
too.
getting
So
pushed back, but he's a very amenable and
He's-
flexible guy apparently. So.
Apparently.
I don't know. He looks pretty crushed to me.
So we'll meet you all again and at 10 o'clock or 10 o'clock Pacific, and we'll continue this.
I may be
Sounds
in
good.
Vermont, so I don't know if I'm going to make it, but I will try.
Well, they don't have technology in Vermont, right?
Everybody bring your wig.
Thank you, everybody. This has been just an outrageously
Yeah, this is
wonderful
great.
conversation.
yeah, very
that's
good
just
conversation.
captivating.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See you on Tuesday.